I'm going to start by asking the panel to give a brief introduction to themselves, and I'll start with Pam first, and then we'll continue with the questions.
Good morning, my name is Pam Citron, and I'm the founder and CEO of Pendo Systems. Pendo Systems is providing intellect, insight, intelligence to the unstructured data, a very important commodity of fuel in that data for compliance, regulations, and I think very important to the ecosystem.
Thank you. John.
Okay, John Byrne, I'm the CEO of Corelytics. I've been in the fintech space for about 25 years. If you look at Corelytics, we look at regulation as a risk, and really we run a lot of risk models based on present and future risk. And lastly, as a disclosure, I'm not a lawyer.
Keva.
Keyvan Alkani, I'm CEO and co-founder of COMPLY2018. And to summarize it, we just try to make the life of compliance professionals a lot easier. So.
Paweł Kuskowski, CEO and co-founder of CoinFirm. We are providing anti-money laundering and terrorist financing solution for cryptocurrency and blockchain.
And you're a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nirvana Fahadi. I head up the financial services RegTech business of Hitachi Vantara, and we work very much in industry in terms of collaboration with regulators, etc., to get RegTech moving in this space. Prior to joining Hitachi, I was in financial services for 20 years. So I came from the dark to the light, or the light to the dark, depends on the day. But without further ado, I'd like to turn some questions to the panel. And my first question is around, what is your perception? Why is RegTech important for everyone in financial services in your view? Why do we think it's important? Why do we think, there's so much buzz about it right now? And how can it help financial services institutions going forward? And what's been the path to adoption of RegTech in FS institutions? There's a lot of questions in that, but I'm going to start with you, Pal, first, and your view on it.
All right, so, I spent over 14 years in compliance. I'm a lawyer, but also, regulatory lawyer, and I was global head of AML for Royal Bank of Scotland. With UBS, work a lot with UBS, HSBC, and the likes. So, compliance in general is a very big problem for big banks, big financial institutions, smaller one as well. And in principle, there's no good solution currently on the market, especially around anti-money laundering and some other big pieces of regulations. If you look for example, how effective is the money laundering system, anti-money laundering system currently in the financial sector, it's almost not functioning, right? Effectively, what you are doing is you are catching 1% of the transactions, which is connected with money laundering, which is almost statistical error. So there's huge opportunity for solutions which are tackling this problem. And RegTech is what we find is effectively you can almost reverse this number and make maybe not 100% compliance, but 95% compliance, out of new way of approaching the old things. So this is there's huge effectiveness which you can bring with RegTech, and there's definitely the way to improve these processes, and if you see the financial institutions, they're spending around 20% of the budget to actually tackle the compliance aspects. Around 15 out of this, 15% would be related directly to anti-money laundering. So there's huge opportunity, and with the RegTech, basically, when you apply proper technology, you can actually, minimize this to go down into like 60%, 70%. So there's, clear opportunity in terms of, efficiencies.
Sure, thank you. John, what's your take on this? Why is RegTech so important for FS institutions? And I'd like to get everybody on the panel's view on this. So,
well, just fundamentally, if you look at regulations and the regulator is a body that gives firms a license to operate. So in the worst possible outcome, isn't actually fines for firms. It's actually that their license to operate is either partially or fully taken away from them. If you look at regulations today, and there are many regulators are in the business of getting better outcomes. And post the 2008 crash, and we talked about it, it really changed the world forever. It means the volume of regulations has gone up, the supervision around regulations has gone up, and the enforcement activity around regulations has gone up. And because of all of those things, sizable firms and smaller firms have a major cost in regulation. So if you look at regulation at one end, for some very complicated businesses, it's gone over 10% of their revenues, not even their costs, their revenues. So technology is the only way to solve that problem. The second thing is there has to be significant change in companies if they're actually to provide better outcomes both to their clients and to their counterparties. And technology is a way that can actually enforce that. In other words, there's nobody running a large firm who actually wants a bad outcome. It's ingrained, though, in different parts of the cultures of organizations. And RegTech can basically clean up the culture of a lot of organizations. And thirdly, what RegTech can do, just for example, I was talking to really the world's fourth biggest bank, and they're saying that when they actually win a big mandate, they can actually lose it because it takes them 47 days to open a commercial account in terms of all the sanctions checking and AML. So if you look at RegTech, it can reduce costs, it can produce better outcomes, and actually it's a good driver for new business as well.
Thanks, John. I mean, certainly from my perspective, at least this year, they've stopped calling it RegTech, which really gets my hackles up. We've got regulation, not regulation. But anyway, Pam, what's your view on it? And what has been the path to adoption, do you think?
Well, I think RegTech is actually a hashtag.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I guess the question is what is one's interpretation or definition of RegTech?
Yeah.
And my fear in that world is that, what was fintech? Okay, what came out of that? What demonstrable thing came to all of us that made that world better? Obviously not enough to not have RegTech, right?
Yeah.
So we didn't get the regulators anymore at bay. So, I think the ability to have technology that facilitates better answers more abruptly, quicker, faster, with more agility and more accuracy is the key. But the underlying foundation to any successful hashtag, including RegTech, is the data, right? And again, I think with RegTech, we're back to starting at the top. And if we don't start fueling those systems or those robots or those artificial intelligence tools with the data that's consumed from the back and all these other places, that's the problem. And to your point about the crash, what we were talking about before we got here, that crash created a whole new world of opportunity. But I don't think anyone stops to think of what it also did, which is it made all of those more systems of record and those legacy systems and processes and procedures that we've had stickier than they were before.
Yeah.
Because we pushed it all back. So it's harnessing what we've got and then being able to put on top the right tools and applications. And I think you'll see it much more driven by not an enterprise RegTech, but more of a specific RegTech solution that people can collaborate on and be able to know that's the best thing I need for this, or this is the best thing I need for BCB 239, which is not what I need for Dodd-Frank.
Exactly. Thank you for that. And Kayvon, what's your take?
I think to add to the panelists, I would say the change of the approach, the ripe for innovation in terms of actually solving a real need as opposed to a concept in search of evidence is what I would look at RegTech. Look at the existing status quo of how regulated industries, specifically financial industries, deal with regulatory change, the amount of money that they spend on it, the amount of time, the inconsistency, the inability to meet SLAs to respond to such changes. And here you have, at the same time, technology, cloud-based infrastructure, cheap CPU, automation come to the rescue to help scale, reduce the cost, and provide consistency. So it's really a combination of the demand in the market with the availability of technology that is now at our disposal that was not available maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Sure. Okay, I guess my next question is, and it touches on your point around regulations and coming, the regulations that RegTech helps to solve for. What would you say, I mean, all heard GDPR. You know, everyone's dealing with that. They've got elbow deep in it right now. MiFID was implemented in Europe. We've had Dodd-Frank, et cetera. But what's on the horizon? What are the biggest regulatory changes coming down on the horizon that we should be aware of? Because right now, everyone I speak to, all their focus is on GDPR, or, you know, the next thing that we've already known about for the past few years. But what are we, in concentrating in that, what are we actually not thinking about and missing? So my question goes to Pam on this one, and then I'll get everyone else's view as well.
Well, there is, you know, we get caught up with our buzzwords and our facts, but even last Friday, in the AML world, they changed to beneficiary ownership, right?
Yes, exactly.
You didn't see it anywhere, but that is a massive impact. But even that impact, you know, has an impact on GDPR. So you know, it's the process by what are these other things that are happening that actually have a root cause, right? Because the regulations have gotten. So something like the beneficiary ownership in AML actually has an implication on GDPR, right? But so that's the destination. But there's a bunch of other rules in between. So I think that the idea is that we're trying to start creating more regulations, right? Where we're looking, you know, yes, it's the bad actors, yes, it's that, but it's almost like the reason robots will never be able to do this is because you're never going to teach your robot ethics.
Yeah.
Right? So where's the boundaries between some of these regulations that are truly helping the industry move it forward versus we're starting to be judgmental and trying to be the ethics patrol on all these other issues?
And to your point, actually, one of the things I always do with regulators when we're working with them and they're at the table, it's just let's take this silly buggery out of it, for want of a better word, and really focus on, you know, practical regulations, understanding why we're regulating something and consolidating some of them, because there are a lot of, you know, different regulations, but asking for the same level of data, for example, out there.
Well, I'll give you that. I'll give you an example with one of our clients, right? We were off doing a bunch of regulatory projects around CCAR, right? And we're not doing regulatory reporting. We're gathering data for them, right? And then we were off in the ML group a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about the same. And I said, well, I've already lifted 40% of this data off of those contracts already. But had we not been in the bridge, right, there is no repurpose of some of this information, which is why they're not reconciling when they get up to the top line, right? So there's an element of where can we repurpose the same data that all the regulators are looking for. And if we start to do that, and they start to see the consistencies versus inconsistencies, I think that we'll get a little bit of leeway if these regulations start to becoming less than more.
Yeah, absolutely. John, what's your take on this?
Well, so we monitor regulations globally, and what's very interesting is different regulators are completely interested in totally different things. So, for example, if you look at prudential regulators, some in Europe are actually looking at climate change as a risk to the balance sheets of, if they're in insurance, but also if they're in banks. But I think the really big thing that's coming down the line is cryptocurrencies. I mean, it's only a matter of time. You know, it looks like a bubble that's going to burst. It's not regulated in any shape or form, even though people like the CFTC have stepped in. So that's a very obvious area. I think as more and more fintech digitizes financial services, if you look at cybersecurity and all of the cyber rules, even though the state of New York has got very tough ones, you're going to see continuous moving out of regulations by regulators. It's never going to be sufficiently good. But I think to Pam's point, you know, it's there's no destination here. It's a journey. The one continuous certainty is there's going to be lots of regulation change all over the place.
You had your hand up. You can go next.
I mean, I think, you know, I can assure you that if we do Comply 2019, 50% of the conversation will be around blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and then AI in terms of regulations. I can 100% assure you that it's going to happen. So it's going to be, you know, AML in the context of blockchain, GDPR in the context of AI. You know, it's going to be, you know, the conversation is going to shift dramatically. You know, so you can see this. You know, almost every regulator is talking about how to regulate, you know, blockchain, cryptocurrencies, or, you know, what kind of problems we're going to have with AI. You know, and I think this is going to be, you know, so we see that, you know, we're going to have the new market and the new regulations coming in, you know, pretty quickly on this particular aspect. But it's going to be impacting a lot of, you know, a lot of industries. finance, but not only finance, because I see most of the, like here, what you are discussing regulation related to financial market. Blockchain will be much wider. AI will be much wider. Crypto will be much wider. It's going to be impacting a lot of industries.
Well, to your point, RegTech is much wider than
Yeah, of
financial
course.
services.
This
It's
is
been around
definitely-
in industries like pharma,
Yeah.
oil and gas, et cetera, for years. And to an extent, we've already had it in financial services with AML technologies, et cetera. But we are on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution with technology leading the way. And everything, all industries and all sectors and the way we interact with each other are going to shift dramatically. So we need something, in my view, like RegTech to keep those checks and balances in place and those technologies behind them. And my next question, which will go to Keyvan, and we can take it from there, is what are the types of technology that we're seeing? We hear words like AI, blockchain, machine learning being bandied around. What's the level of sophistication of those technologies today? Is it an out-of-the-box solution? What are the challenges also with adopting these technologies within organizations?
Absolutely. Just wanted to add a little bit to the prior question also.
Oh, I'll allow that. Go on.
One thing I want to add is keep in mind it's not about regulation, it's also deregulation.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening with the BHCA Bank Holding Company Act and the hints from the OCC in terms of allowing for a bank to have non-financial assets. So say hello to the Bank of Amazon or Bank of Google, and the results of that, which creates a huge amount of competition and maybe friction with traditional banks versus modern technology companies. That's one aspect of deregulation. And then the aftermath of a Facebook fiasco in the United States, I think you're going to start seeing GDPR-like regulations in the United States for data privacy, most likely.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. We talk about blockchain as a phenomenally consequential technology, to answer your next question. And it looks beautiful. You have this distributed ledger. You have the ability to have non-repudiation done properly. And yet, you see a legislation like GDPR, and if you scratch the surface and you see what does it mean when somebody says the right to be forgotten, and you find it to be at odds with the main principle of blockchain as a technology, which says, wait a minute, you cannot change a transaction. You can create another transaction to nullify the previous one, but then both of them exist. A happened and then B happened, versus what GDPR is dictating, saying the user can say, give me both transactions and forget about it. And that is at odds with the blockchain technology. So we're going to have to deal with that kind of reconciliation. From one side, it's a time saver. It provides authenticity. It provides a certain level of accuracy. And from the other side, it has to deal with regulatory matters. You're absolutely right on AI as well. You have now commonplace models and the ability to process large volumes of documents at a fraction, and I mean a very, very small fraction of the time that it would take a very expensive lawyer to process the same documents. And process, what is this document about? Should I even care about it? What's the summary? What topic does it belong to? What should I do about it? And the activity that normally would be done with very expensive and distributed workforce can now be done at a fraction of the time through technology. Computation has become cheap. So now you can do it in the cloud using cheaper processors, taking advantage of off-the-shelf machine learning models that just keep getting better and better and better, and then take advantage of blockchain to ensure authenticity and transaction integrity. Those are some of the ones we saw. On the flip side of it, from a content perspective, we're seeing this, I want to say, turtle-like move towards improving how content is published by the regulators, allowing an API, to be used when content's being published as opposed to having to take a paper document, scan it, or use Freedom of Information Act to ask them to give us the information that is related to regulatory content. Ultimately, technology from the regulator's side, we see a step towards simplifying the publication, the taxonomy, and providing that information. So those are some examples of technology coming to the rescue and being available.
Fantastic. Pam, what about you?
Well, I agree in terms of where the blockchain and the AI and these, I think 3 years is a bit ambitious in the markets that we live in. But I come back to the data, not because that's what I do, but it is. But the fact is that, having been around this, the issues that we're getting is where you see these we saw this in fintech, these great new technologies got released, but when they didn't get healthy data into them, they were producing the same results. So therefore, the person that was making a decision on tech said, well, wait, this answer isn't any better than the one I had yesterday, so I don't need the new stuff, right? But, using AI and getting comfortable with that in these financial institutions that have been around for a long time to accept the robot, right? Because, there are ethics and moral decisions that are being made. You're never going to teach the robot that, right? But it's hard enough to get a new application into a financial institution, let alone, one of the first projects that we did, we opened up 45 million loans to get data out of, unstructured data, pulled out 30 pieces of data out of 45 million documents. And they still had the 800 AMY people checking the dates, the data. And I was like, guys, this isn't working, right? But it took them a good 4 months to trust the data was the data that they thought it was, which seems almost crazy because do you trust the data that's in these legacy systems anymore? I don't know. But you need that data to fuel any one of those efforts, whether that's blockchain, whether that's AI, whether that's robotics, whether that's new workflow of the future. We have to clean the basement, and in the basement is all of this old stuff, right? And all this new stuff coming in. And I think that, that's the part we have to focus on for any of the RegTechs to be successful, and more importantly, for the AI stuff to be successfully implemented in our industry.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Now, on that, you mentioned something earlier, Pam, and saying, you can't teach the robot ethics. So I want to ask the panel the question about what do we think about more tech companies with these kinds of technologies, AI, machine learning, et cetera, being regulated? And how do you see that going? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Do you think it's inevitable? With the whole fiasco of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, Zuckerberg was in Brussels today testifying. So, there's a lot of that coming down the line. What's your view on it? John, I'd like to have
Well, first of all, if you're incorporated in Europe or you do business in Europe, the reality is, as of the 15th of May, you're regulated as far as GDPR is concerned.
Yeah.
That actually means every
you also
organization...
have the data service providers regulations in Europe as well. So
most people will be regulated as data controllers, and that actually means that they will actually need a compliance officer who's going to have to be responsible for this. So we're actually moving into this space anyway. I think there's a couple of issues with AI for RegTech. One of them is, and as a firm, just like all the other firms here, we offer AI-based solutions. The solutions are very greedy for data. So the whole industry hasn't been that fussy about where our data is coming from. So I'll give you an example. A number of regulators in Asia and in the UK own their own copyright. Technically, you have to get permission to start using the data. So it's not even just going to be source data for individuals. There's actually going to be more regulations about how we can lift data from certain places. That's going to be an issue. And I think the second thing is obviously from the Cambridge Analytica, there is going to be every AI company is going to start. There is going to be fallout, and we're all going to be impacted by this. And I think it's about having a code of ethics. I think that's going to be important.
I think, to your point as well, it's also a case of having, and we discussed this backstage, having the regulators at the table to understand the technology and get their heads around how that works, rather than sitting at the table and vetoing and saying, thou must do this or thou must not do that. And perhaps, things like Cambridge Analytica and that could have been prevented had they understood how these types of tech work. What's your view on it, Pal?
I think, if you ask us, you're probably slightly biased in terms of the answers, So, but
that's okay. You're a lawyer. I'll let you off.
Exactly. It's a caveat, basically,
Yeah.
But what I think, and I've been involved in a number of conversations about, how much you regulate or how you regulate and etc. What kind of aspects you are covering with the industry. And one of the example is MiFID directive. I don't know how many of you are familiar with in the US with this aspect of the regulations. But it's effectively, if you look at the total regulations, is 30,000 pages of document, and actually nobody reads this. nobody understands this. Even
Oh, I'm sorry, I had to read it. I had to understand
you
it
did.
and talk about
But
it.
did you go to the technical
I
aspect
did.
of
I
it?
wrote
All right,
the technical
so there you go.
standards
There
for
you have the
transaction
expert on
reporting.
that.
Forgive
but I
me,
think,
but I did.
I mean, on the funny side, we probably should do AI for the, creation of the regulations as opposed
Yeah.
to,
Yes, I would
this is
concur with
something
that.
which you should probably, as structuring data, this would be where it would be really helpful, and getting the outcome out of this,
Yeah.
would be interesting. But I think, the other aspect which I found is, one of the, so many times regulation is trying to kind of fix the problem which is not fixable because there is no solution. So one of the example is again, from the slightly from European market, is durable medium, right? Durable medium is effectively, something which you cannot fake, right? Like document, like when you have terms and conditions, the companies could basically issue the agreement, but which is referring to the terms and conditions. But in the meantime, they can change the terms and conditions, and effectively you live with agreement, and there is no reference to the terms and conditions. So in Europe, there's this concept of durable medium. So you have to prove that these things existed with basically when the agreement was signed. But even, so there's like the only solution which you could actually apply to this, realistically, was paper. But even paper was not sufficient because it's not durable medium. But if you, for example, you spill something on paper, it's not durable anymore. So there's like this regulators were trying to fix this problem with additional regulations,
Sure.
right? Which is crazy. And suddenly, we have technological solution which is stripping out a lot of the unnecessary requirements. But the funny thing is, even if you have perfect solution which is solving this problem, now you have the regulations which was basically trying to fix the a previous problem. So you need to you have perfect solution for the previous problem, but because of the additional regulations which are applicable, it's start to be crazy a little bit in this way. So I think there's a lot of kind of discussion which needs to happen between the regulators and the RegTech companies, what kind of solutions they are bringing.
I think it's certainly not just the regulators, but the whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
RegTech companies, vendors, banks.
Well, I mean, I think that based on everything that we're saying, we should just call it fear tech, okay, instead of RegTech, because it is this reaction to things.
Hashtag fear tech.
Until we get to the point that there's trust in what's coming out, right, on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
The regulations are going to come. And I think that's why I see the customers that we provided benefit, they're phoning a friend and telling them. Because none of these banks are not trying to get off, making sure that they can solve this together.
Yeah,
right?
And collaboration.
Correct.
Absolutely. Yeah. Industry stakeholder collaboration is key with the regulators. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, so I do want to ask this question, and let's step away from the intensity of the regulators and where it's going. But I'm interested, I'm curious, is there a difference of emphasis between West Coast RegTechs and East Coast RegTechs? And John, I want to come to you on that first. Keep it brief, we don't have too much time.
Okay. Well, I think there is. Because first of all, it rains a lot less in the West Coast than it does in Ireland, for example.
Less gloom.
And so it means that my colleague here is probably much more of an optimist than I am. But when it does come to funding, if you look at Silicon Valley, it is the land of the possible. It looks at what's possible. If you look at a company like ours, we would be heavily focused on, say, the London ecosystem in terms of funding. You've much more conservative funders. They want the companies to become profitable much earlier. And I think, therefore, we would have a slightly different focus than the people from Silicon Valley.
Yeah, absolutely. Kayvon, did you have a view on this briefly?
I completely agree. Yeah, there's a different mentality and different level of optimism overall, and it's not just related to RegTech, it's any type of new technology. It's been pretty much the same for the past 10 years, I would say.
Thank you. And Pam, I think you had a good
I think
point
there's a big, I think there's a big difference, but I think that the issue that the West Coast needs to focus on to help all of us is knowing their customer, right? You need to understand the DNA of the financial institutions.
100%.
And so it's not the Wild West. And that's where there's a lot of confusion coming in, that they need to be learn a little bit more about the customer.
Absolutely.
There is a bubble. Yeah.
And we get that a lot. I mean, I get that a lot talking to customers and saying, you need to understand my business problem, you know. And finally, did you have a view? Keep it brief.
I think, there's, in different parts of the world almost, there's different speed on different aspects, So we see this, really almost in every part of the regulatory space, But in some aspects, we have West Coast, coming up sooner, dealing with the problems better, and sometimes it's the other side, So it depends, what kind of aspects you're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you so much for my lovely panel. You've been a delight to work with, and thank you so much for listening to us.
Great.
Pardon?
Learned a lot. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no.